Today, we will talk about one of the most misunderstood prophets in history, a man who dedicated his life to God but reaped pain, humiliation, and betrayal. Jeremiah was not just a prophet, he was a living witness to the destruction of Jerusalem and a symbol of the rejection of truth. Imagine being hated by the very people you try to save, imprisoned, tortured, and abandoned by those who should have heard the voice of God. This is exactly what happened to Jeremiah. He did not prophesy victory, he did not announce times of peace, and on the contrary, his words were filled with judgment and tears. And what happens to those who speak the truth when no one wants to listen? Jeremiah was beaten, thrown into a cistern to die, and according to tradition, murdered by the very Jews who rejected his warnings. He saw kings fall, he saw hunger consume his nation, and he saw the city of God burning in flames. But even in the face of extreme suffering, he never gave up. His prophecies were ignored at the time, but every word was fulfilled. Today, many know him as the prophet of tears, but few understand the weight of his pain. But why did Jeremiah suffer so much? What made him so hated? And why is his story still so impactful today? Get ready, because this is not just a story of persecution. It is a lesson about the cost of truth, the hardness of the human heart, and the faithfulness of God even amidst chaos. And in the end, you might be surprised to realize that Jeremiah was not the only one to face this fate. But first, do you want to discover more about the mysteries and curiosities of the Bible? Subscribe to our channel now and activate the bell so you don't miss any content. From the womb, Jeremiah was destined to be the voice of God to a rebellious nation. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, Jeremiah 1:5. Declared the Lord, marking his prophetic calling in an irrevocable way. But Jeremiah was not a man of great influence or experience. On the contrary, he was young and insecure. Fearing the enormous responsibility that lay on his shoulders, he hesitated. However, God does not accept excuses when he chooses a servant. He promised to strengthen Jeremiah, putting his words in the prophet's mouth and making him a fortress before the obstinate people. The mission that Jeremiah received was not for the faint of heart. He was sent to a people corrupted, who had exchanged the worship of the true God for lifeless idols. In a time of corrupt leaders and wayward priests, his words would be like fire, and the people like straw, Jeremiah 5:14. God made him a fortified city, an iron pillar, and a bronze wall, Jeremiah 1:18, ensuring that, although he would face resistance, no one would destroy him. But being a spokesperson for the Most High did not mean a path free from suffering. Jeremiah soon realized that carrying divine truth is a heavy burden. His early years of ministry were marked by constant warnings and calls to repentance. But who is willing to hear what discomforts them? The people of Judah preferred the false prophets, who soothed their fears with sweet lies, telling them that peace would reign, even as judgment approached. Jeremiah, on the other hand, cried in the streets, warning of the imminent calamity. He was called a troublemaker, a traitor, and an alarmist. How could a man who only wanted to do God's will be treated with such contempt? But contempt would only be the beginning. When the truth is rejected, the messenger quickly becomes the target of the fury of those who do not want to hear it. Jeremiah would learn that his journey would require not only courage, but also resilience in the face of brutal persecution. His days of suffering had only just begun. Divine patience has its limits, and Judah was testing each one of them. For decades, God sent prophets to warn the people of their idolatry, injustice, and corruption, but they refused to listen. Jeremiah, with his voice of pain and urgency, cried out, "Repent, each one from his evil way, and amend your deeds." Jeremiah 7:3. But the stubborn heart of the nation chose to believe in the illusion that the temple would guarantee their safety. After all, how could God allow his house to be destroyed? However, the prophet knew that Judah was on the edge of the abyss. The leaders, those who should have guided the people with justice, were rooted in greed and corruption. Judges sold their sentences, priests profaned the sacred, and prophets preferred to flatter the powerful rather than confront them with the truth. Worship of false gods was practiced on the high hills, and even human sacrifices were offered to Moloch. Jeremiah spared no words. You trust in deceptive words that are of no value to you. Jeremiah 7:8. He called them thieves who use the temple as a hideout. But will anyone who loves the darkness easily accept the light? The response came in the form of hatred. Jeremiah was not just ignored, he was ridiculed and threatened. The false prophets said the opposite of his messages, claiming that God would never allow the destruction of Jerusalem. The people, deceived by these speeches, mocked the prophet. But God had already decided Babylon would be the instrument of his judgment. Jeremiah warned that captivity would come, that the city would be devastated, but no one believed him. After all, there had always been time to mourn before, so why would now be different? The problem was that the time of grace was running out. Jeremiah saw what no one else wanted to see. The smoke of judgment was already rising on the horizon. But spiritually deaf people do not hear trumpets, and voluntarily blind people do not see the signs. The prophet's insistence on speaking the truth would soon cost him dearly. Speaking the truth always has a price, and Jeremiah paid his with tears and blood. The prophet was not only despised, but he also suffered physical assaults for denouncing Judah's sins. In one of his imprisonments, Pashur, the priest responsible for the temple's security, tried to have Jeremiah beaten and placed in the stocks. Jeremiah 22. The prophet spent an entire night tortured, his body contorted, exposed to public humiliation. When released, Jeremiah did not retreat. On the contrary, he looked his torturer in the eyes and announced that God had changed his name to Terror All Around, for his ruin would soon come. The violence was not limited to physical assaults. Jeremiah was constantly ridiculed. They called him an alarmist, a traitor, an agent of Babylon. The word of the Lord has become for me a reproach and a derision all day long. Jeremiah 28. He confessed in a moment of deep anguish. But even when he wished to remain silent, he felt like a fire was burning in his bones, and he couldn't contain the message. He spoke because God commanded, but the cost was high. Being hated by his own people, seeing friends turn against him, feeling alone and abandoned. Jeremiah tasted the bitter sting of exclusion. The persecution did not only come from priests and princes, but also from the people themselves. On one occasion, Jeremiah was dragged to trial and accused of blasphemy for announcing that Jerusalem would be destroyed. The crowd cried for his death, but some wiser leaders reminded them that other prophets had made similar warnings and were spared. He survived, but his safety was far from guaranteed. Later, the nobles, disturbed by his prophecies, conspired to kill him. They threw him into an underground cell where he remained for a long time, forgotten and almost without food. Each day felt heavier, but Jeremiah refused to abandon his calling. His tears were not only for personal suffering, but for the certainty that his people were digging their own destruction. But when someone disturbs too much, sooner or later, they try to silence them once and for all. And that's exactly what happened. There comes a moment when the hatred against the truth becomes unbearable for those who reject it. For the princes of Judah, Jeremiah was a constant threat, a disturbing prophet who insisted on preaching the destruction of Jerusalem. They persuaded King Zedekiah to deliver him, and without a fair trial, the prophet was thrown into a deep cistern. Jeremiah 38:6. The bottom had no water, only mud. Jeremiah slowly sank, feeling the cold and weight of despair. Death seemed imminent, and for the first time, he may have thought that this would be the end of his journey. The cistern was more than just a physical punishment, it was a symbol of utter contempt. Jeremiah was literally in the deepest abandonment, forgotten, without apparent hope. His enemies believed that if he didn't drown in the mud, he would die of hunger. But God always raises unexpected allies. Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian eunuch from the royal court, saw the injustice and decided to act. He went to the king and pleaded for Jeremiah, asserting that it was a sin to let the prophet die in such a way. Zedekiah, weak and manipulable, authorized the rescue. Jeremiah's rescue was not done in haste or brutality. Ebed-Melech showed compassion by throwing rags and old clothes so that Jeremiah could use them as protection when being pulled up by ropes. That small, yet significant act contrasted sharply with the cruelty of the princes. The prophet, almost without strength, was lifted little by little until he finally returned to the surface. The mud was left behind, but the battle had not yet happened. Jeremiah was free from the cistern, but not from the fate awaiting Jerusalem. This experience not only demonstrated divine exceptions, but also revealed how even in dark times, God uses unlikely people to fulfill his purposes. Jeremiah could have died in that pit of mud, but his mission was not yet complete. However, even the rescue could not prevent the tragedy that was about to come. Jerusalem was about to fall, and the prophecy would be fulfilled before the eyes of all. The feared day finally arrived. For years, Jeremiah had warned that the holy city would fall if the people did not repent, but his words were ignored. Now the walls of Jerusalem trembled under the weight of the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, surrounded the city and imposed a cruel siege that lasted for months. Famine ravaged Judah, and those who once feasted now fought over scraps of food. The hands of the compassionate women have cooked their own children. They were their food in the destruction of the daughter of my people. Lamentations 4:10. Jeremiah watched all of this happen exactly as God had said. The siege intensified, and within the walls despair grew. The temple, the pride and symbol of Judah's faith, no longer offered protection. Those who had mocked Jeremiah's warnings now turned against God in desperation. But it was too late. When the defenses crumbled, the invasion was brutal. Soldiers poured in like a flood, shedding blood and setting the city on fire. The screams echoed through the streets, and the pain of Judah was indescribable. The temple, the glory of Israel, was plundered and destroyed by fire. Jeremiah was right, but that was a truth no one wanted to hear. The leaders who had so despised the prophet now tried to flee. King Zedekiah, in an act of desperation, managed to escape at night, but was captured. As punishment, his sons were killed before his eyes, and soon after, he was blinded. Bound in chains, Zedekiah was taken to Babylon, where he would spend the rest of his days. The nobles and priests were killed or deported as slaves. The remaining people were forced to march into exile, carrying the weight of their disobedience. The city that had relied on divine protection had become a heap of smoldering ruins. And where was Jeremiah in the midst of all this? Imprisoned, humiliated, but alive. Unlike Judah's leaders, he earned the respect of Nebuchadnezzar, who freed him and allowed him to choose where he wanted to live. But what comfort is there in seeing one's own nation destroyed? Jeremiah appeared among the few who remained, weeping over the ruins of Jerusalem. And now, with the city's end, a new battle would begin, dealing with a lie that still wanted to challenge what God had already decreed. Not all opposition to Jeremiah came from kings or corrupt priests. Some claimed to be prophets of God, but spoke what the people wanted to hear, not the divine truth. Among them, one of the most notorious was Hananiah. At one of the most critical moments in Judah's history, when the exile in Babylon had already begun, Hananiah appeared before the people and gave a prophecy completely opposite to Jeremiah's. He claimed in the name of the Lord that within 2 years Babylon would fall and the exiles would return. Jeremiah 28:2-4. His words were received with joy and hope, but there was a problem. God never said that. Jeremiah, who wore a wooden yoke on his neck as a symbol of the coming captivity, responded with caution. Would that the Lord would do so? Jeremiah 28:6. He said, wishing it were true. But reality doesn't change with pretty speeches. God had already decreed 70 years of exile, not 2. Enraged, Hananiah tore the yoke from Jeremiah's neck in front of the court, as though he could invalidate the prophecy with a theatrical gesture. The people were ecstatic, preferring to believe the comforting lie rather than the harsh truth. But Jeremiah didn't need to prove anything. God would soon give his answer. Shortly afterward, God instructed Jeremiah to go back and confront Hananiah. The wooden yoke had been broken, but in its place would come an iron yoke, much heavier and unbreakable. Jeremiah 28:13. And then came the divine sentence. This year you will die because you have spoken rebellion against the Lord. Jeremiah 28:16. Hananiah died exactly as it was prophesied, proving that God's truth cannot be manipulated. But for many, it no longer mattered. They had already chosen whom to believe, even if it was a man condemned by his own words. The story of Jeremiah and Hananiah was not just a debate between two men, but a reflection of a larger issue, humanity's preference for illusion over truth. And that was Judah's tragedy. They always rejected what they truly heard and embraced what made them feel good. But ignoring the truth doesn't prevent its consequences from coming. The exile was irreversible, and soon Jeremiah would face a new twist. He would be forced to depart for an even more uncertain fate. After the destruction of Jerusalem, the tragedy was not yet over for Jeremiah. The city was in ruins, the temple reduced to ashes, and most of the people had been taken captive to Babylon. But a small group of Jews remained in Judah, trying to rebuild what was left. Among them were leaders who feared reprisals from the Babylonians and sought guidance. They asked Jeremiah to consult God about what they should do and promised to obey no matter the answer. Jeremiah 42, 5-6. However, when the answer came, it was clear that their words of agreement were empty. 10 days later, God responded, "The people should stay in Judah and trust that He would protect them. Fleeing to Egypt out of fear of Nebuchadnezzar would be a fatal mistake." But as always, the people rejected the word of the Lord. Jeremiah was accused of conspiring with the Babylonians, and against his will, he was taken to Egypt, along with those who had survived the siege. Jeremiah 43, 2-7. The one who had prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem was now forced to leave the promised land. This time, the exile was not imposed by foreigners, but by their own countrymen. In Egypt, Jeremiah continued preaching. Even so, he warned that destruction would reach them, as God would use Nebuchadnezzar to subjugate Egypt as well. But the Jews in Egypt, instead of repenting, increased their rebellion. They began worshiping the Queen of Heaven, a pagan deity, claiming that when they worshipped her in the past, they had abundance. But since they followed God, they had only faced sorrow. Jeremiah 44, 17-18. It was a twisted argument, blaming their own sins on the Creator. Once again, Jeremiah declared that their destruction was imminent. There are no detailed biblical records of what happened afterward. Jeremiah was a prophet who lived to see his warnings fulfilled, but was never heard as he should have been. In Egypt, far from the land he loved, he spoke his last prophetic words. But his fate remains a mystery. Some traditions suggest he was stoned to death by those who could no longer bear his messages. But whether dead or alive, one thing was certain. The truth he preached could never be silenced. And even after his departure, his legacy would still trouble those who insisted on challenging the voice of God. The final fate of Jeremiah is one of the great mysteries of Scripture. The Bible does not record his death, but Jewish and Christian traditions suggest an end as painful as his journey. Some reports indicate that he was stoned in Egypt by the very Jews who had forced him to go there, unable to bear his warnings any longer. It would be an ironic end for a man who spent his life being rejected by the very people he tried to save. Jeremiah, the prophet of tears, would have shed his last over a people who never wanted to listen. If this tradition is true, Jeremiah died as he lived, misunderstood, persecuted, and rejected. His ministry was marked by deep pain, from physical tortures to forced exile. But even in the face of all this, he never strayed from the mission God entrusted to him. Jeremiah never sought applause, never shaped his words to please, never traded truth for access. He remained faithful until the end, bearing the weight of a message no one wanted to hear. His suffering was not in vain, for each of his words came to pass. And if Jeremiah really was stoned to death, his blood joined that of many other prophets who were killed for speaking the truth. Jesus made the persecution that the prophets endured clear, reminding how the people of Israel had always resisted the voice of God. Matthew 23-37. The weeping prophet did not weep only for Jerusalem, but for the fate of those who refused grace and chose the path of destruction. Jeremiah knew his struggle was not against men, but against the hardness of a rebellious heart. But did Jeremiah really lose? His people may have rejected him, but his message has crossed the centuries. His writings inspired prophets, apostles, and even Christ himself. His words, utterances of pain and hope, still echo today. And his story teaches us that following the truth has a price, but no suffering can erase what God has placed. Jeremiah is gone, but his legacy remains, challenging generations to hear the voice of the Lord before it is too late. The story of Jeremiah is not only about suffering and exclusion, but about a calling that transcends pain. He did not choose to be a prophet. He was chosen before he was even born. But his destiny was not one of human glory, but of tears and solitude. The people of Judah despised him, preferred comforting lies, and ignored his warnings. And in the end, everything Jeremiah prophesied came to pass. The city was destroyed, the temple turned to ash, and those who mocked him were taken captive to Babylon. But who was really imprisoned? Jeremiah, who remained faithful to the end, or those who rejected the truth and reaped destruction? How many times does Jeremiah's story repeat itself? How many truths are ignored because they are too hard to face? Humanity has a terrifying tendency to reject what doesn't please it. We prefer sweet words, comforting illusions, even if they lead us to ruin. Jeremiah was not the first to be persecuted for speaking the truth, and certainly not the last. Jesus also died, was betrayed, scourged, and killed by those who wanted to follow God. Jeremiah carried a wooden yoke. Christ carried a cross. In truth, it often costs a great deal. But there is something Jeremiah teaches us. The true servant of God is not the one who seeks applause, but the one who remains steadfast, even when everyone turns against him. He did not see Judah's restoration in his lifetime, but his words crossed centuries and continued to echo. If Jeremiah were here today, would his message be different? Or do we still continue rejecting divine warnings, preferring fleeting illusions? Jeremiah's story ends without a definitive conclusion. But perhaps that's an invitation to reflect on whom we are truly listening to, on the truths we avoid, and on the price we are willing to pay to follow God's will. Because in the end, the question is not whether the truth will prevail, it always prevails. The question is, will we be on its side when that happens?